And there are a number of clans, I think about 6 or 7 clans. Of those clans, one clan had, in significant proportions, the Cohen marker, which appeared to substantiate their claim. But what if that one clan had not given rise to any surviving male progeny? We would have the oral traditions of the other 6 clans, but no genetic evidence whatsoever to substantiate their claim. They would look like black South Africans, and they would appear like and act like black South Africans, essentially. For me, this is more interesting as to turn this example on its head and say, here we have an example of now recognized Israelites that look very little like Israelites. So what would we expect to happen with a small colony, probably much smaller than the original found in London population, in Middle America or in the Western Hemisphere? It seems likely that they would also take on the appearance and assume many of the customs of the indigenous peoples that they intermingled with in various degrees. Okay. Am I going to give just a little bit of license since we started late? Okay. It turns out that genes are not the only things we inherit from our ancestors. They may not even be the most important things we inherit from our ancestors. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament addressed the Gentile converts to the fledging apostolic church, saying, "Now, therefore, ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints, and of the household of God." This was not a genealogical relationship based on lineage or DNA. It made reference to a divine kinship within the family of Christ. In other words, lineage is not the only mechanism by which God's purposes on earth are to be accomplished or His blessings realized. Lineage and genetics are a consequence of the means by which the human family fulfills its divine charge to multiply and replenish the earth, but it does not solely dictate one's potential in realizing the things of eternity. These are non-genetic factors or there are non-genetic factors that also exert tremendous influence on our lives. What, after all, is so special about genes? Asked Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. The answer is that they are replicators, he goes on. Life evolves by the differential survival of replicating entities. The gene, the DNA molecule, happens to be the replicating entity that prevails on our planet. There may be others. I think that a new kind of replicator has recently emerged on this very planet. It is staring us in the face. It is still in its infancy, still drifting clumsily about in its primeval soup. The new soup is the soup of human culture. We need a name for the new replicator, a noun that conveys the idea of a unit of cultural transmission or a unit of imitation. And he goes on and coins the term meme to describe this unit of cultural transmission. And he says that examples of memes are tunes, ideas, catchphrases, clothes, fashions, the way we make pots, buildings, etc. Susan Blackmore wrote in October 1998, in the preface to her book, The Meme Machine, "I had read Dawkins, The Selfish Gene, many years before, but now I suppose I had dismissed the idea of memes as nothing other than a bit of fun." At least she took note of the term, but apparently many researchers skip right over it. She continues, "Suddenly, while reading Dennett's Darwin's Dangerous Idea and a student's paper on memes, I realized that here was a powerful idea capable of transforming our understanding of the human mind, and I hadn't even noticed it." She continues, "When you imitate someone else, something is passed on. This something can be passed on again and again and takes on a life of its own. In many cases, memes are stronger than genes. The gospel is perhaps the strongest of all memes in our lives." Language is another example of the principle of memes. There is often a poor correlation between the ordering of populations on the basis of language as compared to the ordering based on genetic groups. Nephi states that he was educated in the learning of the Jews and in the language of the Egyptians. Later we learn in the Book of Mormon records were kept in Reformed Egyptian. This written language had been handed down through the generations and altered according to their manner of speech. It appears that only men of learning could read the records. The language of common usage by the Nephites was Hebrew, but it had been altered by them as well, according to Mormon 9:33. King Benjamin had his 3 sons, quote, taught in all the language of their fathers, that thereby they might become men of understanding. A privilege, apparently. Zeniff stated that he had been taught in the language of the Nephites. Now, why would he have made such a statement, Zeniff being a Nephite, if there were no alternative languages to distinguish their Nephite language from? Who among us, raised in the United States, would say in the opening of our autobiography, I was taught English when I was young? One way a language can be altered in a relatively short period of time is through extended contact and interaction with speakers of another language or languages and the incorporation of native words. This is especially true when speakers of the original language find themselves in a foreign setting at a loss for words to describe unfamiliar objects and places. Of course, the influence works in both directions, and the native languages would be expected to quickly incorporate foreign words as well. It is therefore interesting to note the repeated observation of parallels to Hebrew in a number of Native American languages. Most recently, Brian Stubbs, a specialist in Near Eastern and Native American languages, has investigated parallels between Hebrew and Uto-Aztecan, a family of languages spoken in Mesoamerica. He proposed 2 hypotheses to explain the relationship between these 2 languages. First, that Uto-Aztecan was originally at its core a Near Eastern language, but later was heavily influenced by non-Hebrew or native tongues. Or 2, that Uto-Aztecan began as the result of a Creole, or a mix of languages in which Hebrew was a significant component. In the history of the British Isles, we have another striking parallel to this phenomenon. The invaders who set themselves up as overlords over the Old English were the Normans, who were Viking raiders from France who spoke an altered form of French. The commoners, the Britons, spoke the native Old English. The language of the commoners became altered by interaction with the French-speaking Normans. The language of the priests, on the other hand, and the keepers of the sacred records, the Bible, was Latin, which was accessible only to the learned and educated. In the end, it was the language of the common populace that won out, English. But in the process, the Old English of 1,200 years ago lost 85% of its original vocabulary, leaving only 15% of the Old English intact 1,000 years later. Likewise, in Central America, it appears to have been the language of the common populace that survived, although considerably altered, while the language of the elite, Hebrew, and the language of the scriptures, Egyptian, became extinct in that region. Evidence of contact, influence, or culture need not rely on genetic mechanisms of replication and transmission from one generation to the next, or from one population to another. Memes are an example of an alternate non-genetic form of transmission. The Lamanite legacy of rejecting the covenant is unlikely to have left an obvious trail of genetic markers, but is quite historical, and its influence will likely be found to extend across generations. So, to try to wrap this up quickly, coming back to the principle of covenant. The principle of covenant was very familiar to the Israelites. They saw themselves as the kindred of Yahweh. By entering into the covenant, they entered into a divine kinship, which had reciprocal obligations for both members. They saw this not only as a legalistic contractual arrangement, but that it became a blood relationship, a blood kinship, and was treated accordingly. So when the Apostle Paul talks about converts to the church becoming the adopted seed of Abraham and heirs to the mission and joint heirs to the promises, it was the acceptance and commitment to the binding terms of the covenant that justified justify the recognition of kinship. The Lord declared to Abraham, I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee above measure, and make thy name great among all nations, and thou shalt be a blessing unto thy seed after thee. And in their hands they shall bear this ministry and priesthood unto all nations. And I will bless them through thy name. For as many as receive this gospel shall be called after thy name, and shall be accounted thy seed, and shall rise up and bless thee as their father. But where's the archaeological evidence of Abraham?